question comes in a tweet from Twitter user Dana Phelan. If the Senate Judiciary Committee doesn't have the votes in person to pass her out of committee, how can they rush this? Hashtag Ask Preet. I suppose by her, you're referring to the nominee to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. Well, first of all, it seems at this point that they will have the votes. There are two Republican senators who are on the Judiciary Committee, Tom Tillis and Mike Lee, who have contracted coronavirus and are at this moment quarantining. But at least Mike Lee, if not both Lee and Tillis, have said they are coming back for the hearings, which begin on Monday, October 12th. So if that happens and they are present, they would have all the votes they need in person, 12 Republicans, 10 Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And even if they're not able to come back, there have been Judiciary Committee meetings and hearings that have occurred over the last few months during the pandemic remotely, where either one or more senators appears remotely, or maybe even the nominee appears remotely. And in that case, whether or not Tom Tillis and Mike Lee have finished their quarantine, they would be able to participate in the hearings. And then most importantly, the vote in the committee wouldn't happen for several more days, by which time the 14 days will have elapsed. And in any event, although this is not allowed on the floor of the Senate, proxy voting is allowed in the committee. So Tom Tillis and Mike Lee can just simply give their votes to Lindsey Graham and accomplish what will likely be a 12-10 ultimate vote for Amy Coney Barrett in the committee. This question about Trump's taxes comes from Twitter user Pratik Singhal. Based on the latest New York Times report, do you think there is probable cause for bank fraud or tax fraud, or does it appear to be just a political issue rather than a legal one? Love your show. Hashtag Ask Preet. Well, thanks for the compliment about the show. Obviously, you're referring to that New York Times report that came out 71 years ago. Oh, no, it was like 9 or 10 days ago, that suggested that Donald Trump, or that reported that Donald Trump has paid barely anything in taxes over the last number of years. Some years paying as little as $750, and some years paying actually zero in federal income tax. There's also reporting that Donald Trump owes up to $421 million to unknown and unidentified lenders. There is a suggestion that in various transactions, perhaps, he has overstated his monetary worth or his financial wherewithal in order to get credit and loans. So to go to your question about bank fraud and tax fraud, although lots of people want to draw that conclusion based on the New York Times report, I don't see anything in the New York Times report that by itself and on its face gives you probable cause for bank fraud and tax fraud. A probable cause is a term of art. If you have probable cause in our system, that's enough evidence to actually make an arrest. And I don't think there's an arrest that's about to be made. It does raise questions, and it does raise suspicions about how Donald Trump handled his finances. There is a clear record of tax avoidance, which is not unlawful. I think there would need to be more investigation to find out if there was tax evasion, which is not lawful. What we do know is that Cy Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney, has been looking at the Trump financial situation for some time, and there's been suggestion and reporting that he may be looking at that. And what the New York Times focused on was tax information. And I think to make out a case of bank fraud of the type that seems to be suggested, you would not only need the tax information to figure out what the financial wherewithal and standing of Donald Trump might be, but also need to figure out what the representations have been to outside financial institutions. And if you combine those two things and you see there was a fraudulent representation about Donald Trump's financial standing in order to get some benefit from a bank, then you would have potentially the makings of a bank fraud case. But I think from the New York Times article alone, it is something that should launch an investigation or further an investigation that's already underway, like the one in Cy Vance's office, but alone doesn't set out a case for bank fraud or tax fraud. And by the way, just as I'm recording this, a few minutes before I started recording this, the news came that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals has once again ruled in favor of the Manhattan DA, insofar as he can get information, financial, tax information from Donald Trump's accountants. You'll remember that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court sent it back to the district court. Trump's lawyers continued to fight it in the district court, lost there. They have now lost again in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And as I understand it, Cy Vance is waiting to enforce the subpoena until Donald Trump makes his, hopefully, final last stop at the Supreme Court once again. This question comes from Twitter user BRX False Arrest. I like your Twitter handle. Hashtag Ask Preet. What's the best argument for nominee Barrett to recuse herself from a future Trump versus Biden? And what's the best argument for making her answer the recusal question at her hearing? Asking for a certain Chief Justice who wants to maintain the integrity of the court. Thanks for your question. It's one that's come up on the show, and it comes up all the time when people are talking about how the confirmation hearing will unfold for Amy Coney Barrett. As we've discussed on the show before, there's very little anyone can do to compel a Supreme Court justice to recuse themselves. There have been cases of recusal. We've mentioned the case of Clarence Thomas, recused himself from the famous Virginia Military Institute case, whose majority opinion was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because Clarence Thomas's son was a student at that institution at the time. And there have been cases when sitting members of the Supreme Court had been involved in a particular litigation earlier on, like Elena Kagan, when she was Solicitor General in the Obama administration. And there's some other examples of those sorts of things, but this is self-policing. There's no higher arbiter to whom a recusal decision or a non-recusal decision can be appealed. So what you're left to in the confirmation hearing is political argument and persuasive argument to try to convince Amy Coney Barrett to recuse herself should there be an occasion for her to be the deciding vote on some election-related matter. And one thing is, as you will hear in the interview with Mark Elias, although people are freaking out about this possibility of an election-related Supreme Court case that could give the presidency back to Donald Trump, the likelihood of that is not high. It would require an extraordinary set of circumstances and a narrow victory, the narrowest of victories in a particular state, for it to wind up in the Supreme Court and for Amy Coney Barrett to be in that position. There are also people who argue that even if there's not a ninth justice, you basically have, on an election-related matter, likely a 5-3 court with John Roberts in the 5. And so the addition of Amy Coney Barrett just makes it 6-3. It doesn't break a 4-4 tie. But notwithstanding that, I think the best argument for why she should recuse herself and why she should be made to answer the recusal question is an appearance one. And it also relates to the integrity of the court and people's faith in the court. You have to think about the context in which we're finding ourselves. The election isn't coming up. The election is going on right now. In fact, voting began before Amy Coney Barrett was even nominated to the Supreme Court. And you have the President of the United States saying openly and notoriously over and over again that one of the reasons he wants Amy Coney Barrett to be confirmed before the election is to have 9 Supreme Court justices. And he says this explicitly, to decide any election-related case. And what does he mean by that? He means decide in his favor, because he assumes, like he assumes in all instances, that people who he puts in positions of power, whether they're U.S. attorneys or attorneys general, are loyal to him. He has no doubt in his mind that if it came down to it, the mere fact of his nominating Amy Coney Barrett will be the deciding factor in how she comes out on any issue. He doesn't have this concept of neutral application of the law. In his mind, he wants the ninth justice, Amy Coney Barrett, to be there for precisely this reason, to help him win the election. Whether or not that's true, whether or not that makes sense, that is what he wants. And there are other people who are allies of the president, including Ted Cruz, who says over and over and over again, we need that ninth justice to decide the election. So this may not be the fault of Amy Coney Barrett, although some people fault her for even accepting the nomination under these circumstances. But the person who nominated her and other people who have pledged their support for her are putting her in the position of looking like, if such a case comes before her, of looking like she's going to put the thumb on the scale for the president. And to remove any doubt about that, and to remove the bad taste in people's mouths about that eventuality, she should commit to recusing herself. And I think the Democrats are right to press her on it. Because what will happen to respect for the court, already in decline, if there comes a moment when Amy Coney Barrett becomes potentially the deciding vote on an election-related matter, after all this debate and argument has taken place, and after the president has telegraphed that that's the reason he wants her on the court? That's my best answer. Stay tuned. There's more coming up right after this. We're in the midst of a presidential campaign unlike any other. With the country in crisis, November's election will be one of the most consequential moments in American history. Getting to know the candidates, their policies, their histories, and who they are at their core is a critical part of the process. Kamala, Next in Line, is a new podcast from Wondery and MSNBC. Host Joy Reid will take you inside the unique journey of our country's first black vice presidential candidate. First Indian American, too. From her upbringing in California to making her mark in Washington, D.C., you'll hear Kamala's story as it's never been told before. Interviews with those who know her best will introduce you to the real Kamala. Kamala Next in Line is out now. Subscribe to Kamala Next in Line on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Or you can listen ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Bolia Vineyards is one of the oldest wineries in Napa. And .com. Mark Elias, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. I should point out to folks that we go way back from my time in the Senate, back in, I think, 2005, when I think you helped me understand for the first time how certain campaign finance laws work. So I want to thank you for, I think, multiple tutorials you gave me back in the 2000 aughts.
I think that's right. Although I don't think you should thank me for knowing that. It was pretty arcane, as I recall.
I mean, I thought I understood aspects of the law fairly well when I came there. I had been in AUSA for 5 years, but campaign finance stuff made my head spin more than almost anything else I worked on in the Senate.
Yeah, it's a very it's a complicated area of the law, both because it's heavily regulatory and also because the courts have been so active in rewriting so many of the campaign finance laws. So it's one of these areas where you look at the statute and it bears very little resemblance to what the actual law in practice winds up being.
Can I ask you a question? How are you even able to do this podcast? Shouldn't you be in court?
So,
like, what do you? I mean, I don't mean to be overly humble, but there's lots of cases going on. What are you doing here?
Yeah, so we have 36 cases pending in federal and state court. The good news is that I've got a big team of lawyers who are working with me, so that's good. The bad news, which has actually facilitated this, is COVID, so that so many of the court appearances now are remote. So the days of having to jump from plane to plane to go to courthouses is on hold.
It reminds me of the time when I was the U.S. attorney and I was getting off the train at Grand Central, and it was in the midst of this big insider trading trial, one of the big early ones against Roger Rutnam, and the commuter comes up to me and he says, "Aren't you that guy Preet Bharara?" And I said, "Yes." He's like, "Well, what are you doing here?" I think it was like 9:40 in the morning.
You're late.
And he said, "Shouldn't you be in court?" I said, "What?" He's like, "That guy, that insider trading guy." And I said, Roger Rutnam. He's like, "Yeah, shouldn't you be in court?" And I said, I've got people for that. So you have a lot of people too, Mark.
Yeah.
How many people do you have?
So my group is 53 lawyers, but we actually have more than that right now working on different aspects of different cases.
So we have a lot of things to talk about. You and I had a conversation a few weeks ago in which you scared the bejesus out of me. And I wanted to.
It's the only reason why you had me on your podcast.
Well, I thought. Look. One reason you're on, obviously, is because you're the nation's foremost expert on a lot of these issues, on voting and everything else, and you're fighting hard to make sure that every vote counts, particularly Democratic votes. But also, you're very blunt. We're recording this on Monday, 29 days before the election, October 5th. Not before the election ends, I should say, to be more accurate. And I think people need to understand what's at stake, not just what's at stake, but how things can go wrong and how they can most effectively make sure that their vote counts and other people's votes count. So can we dive into one of the thickets?
Sure.
Mail-in voting.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of pitfalls to mail-in voting, so I thought we go through some of them. So as an initial matter, millions of mail-in votes have already been cast, right?
Correct.
How is that going so far from your perspective?
As you point out, millions of people have already gotten and filled out and returned their mail-in or absentee ballots. And contrary to what the president was saying for a long time, those two terms are synonyms. The Republicans seem to now acknowledge that. So whether you call it absentee or mail-in, millions of ballots have been returned. Here's what we know. Number one, it does seem like there is wide adoption of mail-in voting. So the number of ballots that have been returned exceed by multiple the comparable numbers 4 years ago or 2 years ago. They seem to be more democratic. In other words, more registered Democrats are voting by mail or returning mail-in ballots than Republicans. And in the states that we have data from, we are tracking rejection rates. And I think that's an important thing for people to keep in mind, is that when you vote in person, the chances that your ballot in person doesn't count are infinitesimally small. When you vote by mail, some number of ballots that get cast by mail wind up getting rejected. And that's what a lot of the focus of the litigation I've been involved in is on. And it's, it's something when you look at the primary data in different states, you saw some states had alarmingly high rates of rejections. Others had more typical rates.
I want to get to the rejection.